The starting point for all of our original nations and peoples, including our sacred sites and significant and ceremonial places, is our free and independent existence, extending back to the beginning of time through our oral histories and our oral traditions. That free and independent existence means something. It especially means something in the face of systems of domination and dehumanization that were brought here by the monarchies of Christendom in the 15th and 16th and later centuries. What we're going to be examining is the Doctrine of Discovery, or the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. The story of the Doctrine of Christian Discovery is a story of the doctrine of Christian domination and dehumanization. That doctrine is found in documents issued by popes in the Vatican during the 15th century, which declared war on the non-Christian world and instructed Christians to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce them to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. If that's part of the Christian message, and by us speaking against that somehow makes us anti-Christ because we're against the domination and dehumanization system, then what does that say about Christianity? But if the domination and dehumanization system is not something that Christians and other people believe in or subscribe to, then they should join us in working to abolish and disestablish the system that has resulted in the dehumanization of original nations and peoples throughout the planet and continues to do so to this day.
In June of 1864, a U.S. Senate debate was held concerning the extraordinary amount of money needed to implement U.S. Indian policies. What began as a debate on money matters evolved into a heated debate on the U.S. government's relationship to the Native American nations.
The whole relation between the Indian tribes and the United States is the most ridiculous possible. And I hope someday or other, a gentleman familiar with the subject will bring in a bill abolishing the whole system. I believe the very worst enemies to these people, in many cases, are the men that the government of the United States employs as agents to protect them. Our white people constantly encroach on them and do them great wrong. It's the duty of the United States to protect them.
This glorification of the Indian character and the poetic tale of his wrongs inflicted by this government in the purchase of their lands is a phantom of the poetic brain. We have paid to these Indians and invested for their benefit millions in money, and have thus brought to their doors all the arts of a Christian civilization. If they refuse to merge into and become part of the superior race, they must necessarily be destroyed. It is a law of humanity.
We are a different race. It is not that the government has inflicted wrong. It grows out of the case itself. The contact of the two races side by side upon the frontiers of Christian civilization. God, in his providence, is giving this continent to millions of human beings of higher civilization and leading the advanced guard of human and Christian civilization.
No word is more vague and has permitted the commission of more crimes than that of civilization. The histories of all colonies begins with violence, injustice, and shedding of blood. The result is everywhere the same: the disappearance of the native races, des races sauvages, coming into contact with civilized races. Charles Salomon, 1889, 19th century international law scholar. Pagans in the Promised Land, decoding the doctrine of Christian discovery. Stephen Ucum.
When you look at the quote from Senator Harland of Iowa and the clip that we just saw, and you examine the language, what he says is that if the Indians will not merge themselves into a superior race, they must be necessarily destroyed. That's that part of that genocidal principle. And then he says, it is a law of humanity. When you parse that, what you see is actually two different categories, a category of humanity and those outside of that category. The category of humanity considers it to be a superior race, and the original nations and peoples of this territory, of this continent, of this hemisphere, they actually are considered to exist within a subhuman or a non-human category. And therefore, through that dehumanization process, there's a presumption of a right of domination. And what has been commonly and typically called the Doctrine of Discovery is actually the doctrine of domination. And whenever you talk about domination, you have a correlative or a corollary of that. So you have what's above, and then you have what's below. Dr. Luis Rivera Pagan writes the following in his introduction to A Violent Evangelism. Perhaps the main defect of many modern studies of the age, meaning the age of discovery, consists in not recognizing the primacy of the theological discourse in 16th century ideological production. Truly, the Spanish conquerors of the Americas were driven by their quest for God, gold, and glory. But it was the language related to God, theology, that served to rationalize avarice and ambition, not vice versa. It was religion that attempted to sacralize political domination and economic exploitation. One of the things I want to ask you to start out is, how did you come to write the book?
Well, yeah, it was the end of the 90s, the end of the 80s, the end of the 80s. And at that moment, under the leadership of Spain, in all countries of Latin America, there were established committees for the celebration of the 500 years of the discovery of America. And I was concerned about the emphasis on discovery. Because discovery is always a nice word. It's good to discover something. But sometimes the concept of discovery can be used to occlude, to take out of the sight of people what was happening under the concept of discovery. And I was convinced that at the end of the 15th century and at the beginning of the 16th century, theological issues were important. Because the main reason that was given by Spain and by the Pope at that time to consolidate the sovereignty of Spain over this island first and over the rest of this vast continent was to convert and to Christianize the natives. So therefore one had to take seriously the matters of religion and theological issues in that process. Right now, in our time, when we think about spreading the gospel or doing missionary work, we think about churches preaching. But at the end of the 15th century, they also had the conception of a Christian nation, defending the faith or spreading the faith not only by preaching. That's why, for example, when the Pope Alexander VI in May of 1493 decreed those lands were to be possessed by the Kingdom of Castile perpetually, he mentioned that King Fernando and Queen Isabel had done a great thing for Christendom, namely have eliminated, the Pope says, the tyranny of the Saracens infidels. So that the idea that the gospel could be spread by means of war, by means of weapons, was not necessarily a bad idea in the 15th century and the 16th century.
Domination, the language of the papal bulls.
The theme of domination is found in various Vatican documents from the 15th century. For example, in the papal bull of May 4th of 1493, Pope Alexander VI says that it is pleasing to the divine majesty that barbarous nations be subjugated. The Latin word is deprimentur, which means to reduce, to cast down or press down, to hold down, and it also states that it is pleasing to the divine majesty for the Christian empire to be propagated. Pope Alexander VI stated, "We trust in him, from whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed." The Holy See of the Catholic Church issued many such documents even before 1493. For example, in 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a directive to King Alfonso of Portugal to go to the western coast of Africa and to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. That directive was reissued in 1455, 1456, 1481, 1493, 1506, and 1514. So why was the document called a bull? It had to do with the fact that the document was sealed with wax, and that wax was imprinted with the papal ring and the insignia of the Holy See. From that wax was hung a red silken thread, and at the end of the red thread was a lead ball, and the Latin word for ball is bulla. What these documents demonstrate, though, in terms of the language that was used, is the pattern or the paradigm of domination and dehumanization. And this is very clear by looking closely at the kind of language that was used in those documents. They go back to a root word, domo, in Latin, which is a very unusual and obscure word. And it has 7 main meanings: to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, to domesticate, to cultivate, and to till. To cultivate in Latin is colere, which means to colonize or design. When you take the root of colonize, you have colon, which is the digestive tract of the body politic that is coming in invasively into the lands and territories of indigenous nations and peoples. And that colonizing, digesting activity makes that predator body politic a devouring, consuming body that's coming in invasively on top of the original nations and peoples.
Organic laws.
So when we take the history of these documents that I'm talking about, the papal documents, and we look at how they influence and inform U.S. law, then it's fascinating. There's a book from 1877 called Federal and State Constitutions, Colonial Charters, and Other Organic Laws of the United States. And in that book, it takes each and every one of the states existing in 1877. By the way, the book was published by the U.S. Government Printing Office. But it takes each of those states and it traces the originating documents back to their earliest origins. So in the case of Florida, as an example, the originating documents for the current state of Florida are the prerogatives granted to Columbus by the King and Queen of Spain in 1492 and the Papal Bull of 1493. Only in Latin, by the way. It's not even published in English in that book. And then when you trace that forward, what you find is that all of the states in the South and the Southwest, such as Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, sections of Idaho, they trace back to that same origin. Anywhere that the Spanish crown claimed rights of discovery and domination from the earliest times, that still continues to today. And the United States is considered to be the successor country to the prerogatives granted to Columbus and to the Papal Bull of 1493. So that's the actual organic law of the United States in those areas. But it is even more extensive than that, because it turns out that because Spain had possession of what was called the Louisiana Purchase Territory, the Louisiana Colony, from the period of around 1763 until 1803, that Spanish Crown law also is considered to be part of the organic law of the entire Louisiana Purchase Territory.
Theology and legal pretensions.
In the 1823 legal decision Johnson and Graham's Lessee versus McIntosh, the U.S. Supreme Court used the Doctrine of Discovery to define Indian land title in the legal system of the United States. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. Ascendancy, governing power, domination. The potentates of the old world found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity exchange for unlimited independence. But as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary, in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law, by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted, should be regulated as between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments.
While the different nations of Europe respected the rights of the natives as occupants, they asserted the ultimate dominion to be in themselves, and claimed and exercised as a consequence of this ultimate dominion a power to grant the soil while yet in possession of the natives.
In his book, New Worlds for Old, William Brandon said the following: "Political power grown from property, dominion, was in effect domination."
These grants have been understood by all to convey a title to the grantees, subject only to the Indian right of occupancy. Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. Reaffirming the Doctrine of Discovery.
In August of 1935, a commission was established by Congress by joint resolution. The commission was established to commemorate and celebrate the 150th anniversary of the United States Constitution. As a result of that commission's work, a book was published in 1937 entitled The Story of the Constitution, and it was primarily authored by Saul Bloom, a New York congressman. In the opening of that particular book, we find Part 1, Origin of the United States, Chapter 1, Discovery, Title to the Soil. And it says, King Henry VII of England turned a cold shoulder upon Christopher Columbus when he asked for financial aid in undertaking a highly speculative voyage in search of India by sailing westward from Europe. But Henry VII, a keen and enterprising monarch, quickly realized the importance of Columbus's discovery, and in 1496 commissioned John Cabot to go out and discover countries then unknown to Christian people, and take possession of them in the name of the English king. According to the book, Cabot made 2 voyages, and by 1498 had sailed along what is now the coast of the United States and claimed it for England. By tacit agreement, the European sovereigns rested their respective claims upon priority of discovery. The natives were regarded as heathens, possessing no rights of sovereignty. So here you have the acknowledgement by the United States government and a commission that was chaired by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, acknowledging the right of discovery that Chief Justice Marshall said in Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823 was confined to countries then unknown to Christian people, which means the countries that were inhabited by unbaptized nations and peoples of the planet. In the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954, there was a case that had reached the Supreme Court called Tehitan Indians versus the United States. And in that particular case, it had to do with timber in the Tongass National Forest and given to a particular logging company by the Department of the Interior. And the Tehitan Indians sued for compensation, saying that their timber had been taken from them without a right on the part of the United States. The U.S. Justice Department sent a legal brief to the U.S. Supreme Court in that case. And the main argument of the Justice Department was the Christian nations of Europe having located and discovered the lands of heathens and infidels. And the U.S. Justice Department also cited Genesis 1:28 and the book of Psalms and the Old Testament.
And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and dominate the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and every animal that creeps on earth.
And use that and this reasoning about Christians and non-Christians as the basis of its legal argument in Tehitan. In the following year, 1955, the majority decision in Tehitan was written by Justice Stanley Reed. And Stanley Reed had written a dissenting opinion in an earlier case called Alcee Band of Tillamook's. And in that particular case, Stanley Reed said that the theory put forward in the Johnson ruling was that discovery by Christian nations gave them sovereignty over and title to the lands discovered. He used that exact same reasoning in the Tehitan ruling of 1955. And so when you look at that, you'll see that he cites to the chapter in Henry Wheaton's Elements of International Law. According to the European ideas of that age, the heathen nations of the other quarters of the globe were the lawful spoil and prey of their civilized conquerors. He further said, it thus became a maxim of policy and of law that the right of the native Indians was subordinate to that of the first Christian discoverer, whose paramount claim excluded that of every other civilized nation and gradually extinguished that of the natives.
United States Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit, San Francisco, California.
On August 27, 2014, a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco demonstrated a contemporary application of the Doctrine of Discovery in the Johnson versus McIntosh decision. They did so in a case regarding the Kumeyaay Nation ancestral remains in California. In its decision, in White versus the University of California, the Ninth Circuit panel said that the Kumeyaay Nation has only an aboriginal interest in the lands it occupies. As the court stated, aboriginal interest in the land generally is described as a tribe's right to occupy the land. It is not a property right. amounts to a right of occupancy, which the sovereign grants and protects against intrusion by third parties. Teton, Indians versus United States, 1955. That right, which is residual in nature, comes from the legal theory that discovery and conquest gave conquerors the right to own the land, but did not disturb their tribe's right to occupy it. As recently as 2005, the United States Supreme Court applied the Doctrine of Discovery in footnote number 1 in the case City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, written by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Under the Doctrine of Discovery, fee title to the land occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign. First, the European nation, and later the original states and the United States. This language from the U.S. courts raises the question: when will the United States stop using the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination against our original free nations and peoples?
And so this is the system that we're up against as our original nations and peoples. The Canadian system has also used Johnson versus McIntosh as a legal precedent. And the entire history of the papal bulls, of the charters of England, the charters of France, and all the rest of it applies directly to the context of Canada and forms the context for the Idle No More movement that's going on right now, and all of the issues that are pertaining to the First Nations and the original nations and peoples of that part of Great Turtle Island. That domination and dehumanization system continues to be used against original nations and peoples on every continent and region of the planet. The book I have here, The Caribbean as Columbus Saw It, by Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison and Yes, and Mauricio Abrigont. And there's an interesting section in here. It's talking about Columbus arriving at the first, in what they named San Salvador, the island of Guanahani. And so the authors give this account, and it says that Columbus drew his sword and pointed it toward heaven, cried out, quote, "I hereby take possession of this island, to which I give the name San Salvador in the name of the king and queen, my mighty sovereigns."
It's a liturgical ceremony.
It's a liturgical ceremony, which means a religious.
Yeah, it is. It's a matter of the sword and the cross.
Okay.
It's devoting San Salvador
Yes.
to the Savior.
Yes.
What he's doing is really baptizing the islands.
And so this idea of also baptizing the lands and the territories of the original nations and peoples is very key to understanding the nature of the story.
Yeah, the first to be baptized in the island, and then later on the natives, and which means also giving them
Right.
a Christian name.
So they come ashore with the royal standards, which they put into
And
the
the cross.
soil, and the cross, but also the sword, which is also the symbol of a cross,
Yes.
with the handle and so forth, and the blade. And then the way in which they proceed is to lay claim or to say they have taken possession. All right? So when you have people existing or peoples existing in a place for countless generations, and someone else comes and claims possession of that, then it seems to me that in and of itself is an act of domination.
It is. It's absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nullus, unbaptized nations and peoples.
There's a very unusual term that I came across in my research. It was identified by Francis Lieber, who was the first political scientist of the United States. And when he looked back at the history, he said that there was a term that he called terra nullius. Nullus meant a heathen, pagan, infidel, or unbaptized person. So lands that were inhabited by non-Christians, those who were unbaptized, had no right to an original free and independent existence, that is, free and independent of Christian domination. Any Christian ruler that was able to identify and locate those lands had the right to go in there and exert a territorial domination in relation to those lands. And that's the basis upon which the U.S. federal Indian law system was developed.
There is in my book a long section about the discussion of whether those native people, are they truly human? Are they truly rational? Can they govern themselves? The idea of Aristotle that barbarians do not have the kind of culture and rationality that the civilized people like the Greeks was very common. Some Spaniards will look at the Native Americans and will say, hey, they are barbarians. They are barbarians. The difference is that Aristotle did not want to convert the barbarians to any kind of religion. So that in Spain there was a problem. Yeah, they are barbarians, but they seem also to be human. They seem to be also descendant of Adam and Eve, and therefore we have the commission to convert them. Now, to convert them does not necessarily mean to bring them to our own level, because they are barbarians. That doesn't mean they don't have a place in society. Yes, they have their place in society. They have to work. Who's going to do the work in the mines or in the fields or in here? Somebody has to do the work. That's their role in history. That's their role in society. We have to convert them, but they will be converted barbarians, and they will keep working. We have also to take precautions. I mean, we have to impose a system of domination that might keep those people at the place.
Yes.
Because if we show any kind of weakness, they will rebel.
Yeah.
Which is always the problem of any society that has servants or slaves.
So there's a key element here. Not only are they barbarians, as seen by the Spaniards, but also they are unconverted barbarians. So they're unbaptized barbarians. But they never cease to be barbarians. They only become converted barbarians, meaning baptized barbarians. Now, it's my contention that the use of the word human is a very specialized category. In other words, when they use the word human, they don't mean just any Homo sapiens. They don't mean the broad category of human beings in the general sense. They mean a very specific type of human, which is from the Greco-Roman trajectory of history. So it's the Greek, Roman civilization and everything that follows from that. That's what they mean by the term human. Would you say that's...
Oh yeah. That's the tradition of the humanities.
Yes.
Because the humanities always referred to the Greco-Roman civilization and some elements of the Bible.
Yes.
Especially those parts of the Bible that were written in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But you know, I was saying that some people say those are barbarians. But other Spaniards would use other term.
Okay.
Beast.
Ah, yes. Bestias.
Bestias.
Yes. One of the most interesting periods of time that I found is something called, in Roman history, called the Dominate. The Dominate. And I asked a Latin scholar, how would you translate the Dominate in English? And he said, everything under domination. You could reverse that and say domination over everything. And either way in which you frame it, it's still the domination-subordination system. That's the dimension of the language that people have not understood and that we're trying to reveal at this time. That's what's behind what was been called the Doctrine of Discovery. It's really the doctrine of dominance or the doctrine of domination. And it's about time that this was revealed to the world.
Genocide and the effects of intergenerational trauma.
According to Sherburne Cook and Woodrow Bora, the Mexican native population was reduced from about 25.2 million in 1518 to 1.37 million in 1595. What I found in my research is one of the reasons, for example, for the many suicides and for many depression, is that element of we used to live here and suddenly this is not ours. Suddenly our religious beliefs are stupid and false. An invasion by a guy called the devil, Satan, and everything we have believed and done is mistaken from now on. They are our owners and they tell us how to live. There are testimonies of extreme depression that will go either through the way of suicide or desperate
Infanticide.
infanticide even,
Yes.
or desperate insurrection.
Yes.
Kill me, but I am not going to live this way. But that absolute devaluation of one's being and one's history. There is a Franciscan in Mexico in the middle of the 16th century, Bernardino Sahagún. He wanted to write a history of the customs and ideas and cultures and religiosity of the Mexican Native Americans. And he begins to ask the old people, the ancianos, the elders, who still have the memory. And then the elders tell Sahagún how it was. And at one moment, Sahagún has a brief section in the middle of the book saying, "Oh my God, what have we done?" When he discovered that there was a civilization, and there was art, there was culture, there were deeds of strength and resistance and dignity, and suddenly, what have we done to these people?
We maintain that the principle declared in the 15th century as the law of Christendom, that discovery gave title to assert sovereignty over and to govern the unconverted, has been recognized as part of the national law, the law of nations for nearly 4 centuries, and that it is now recognized by every Christian power in its political department and its judicial.
If they refuse to merge into and become parts of the superior race, they must necessarily be destroyed. It is a law of humanity.
I think of this Western Hemisphere, all of it, as the domain of, as Churchill described it, from this hemisphere, Western Christendom. The foundation of Western civilization, Judeo-Christianity, the values that come from the Old and New Testament, the values that Christopher Columbus brought here across the ocean, and that great footprint of the moral values and the ethics that are emerged as part of our Old Testament values, our New Testament values, the idea of the Protestant work ethic and turning the other cheek and building a civilization, a society to provide the best opportunity for salvation, to glorify God and our country, and understand, as our founding fathers understood, that our rights do come from God, and to promote that. The full-throated Americanism as the leaders of the free world of Western Christendom has not been asserted strongly enough in this hemisphere, and is certainly not strong enough in other hemispheres, Mr. Speaker.
Bartolome de las Casas, a brief account of the destruction of the Indies, 1552.
What I'm about to read comes from a book by Bartolome de las Casas, who was a Dominican priest in the Caribbean. He started out as an encomendero during the time of the conquistadors, which means he was given a grant of land and Indians. But he was so disgusted with the genocidal treatment of the Indian peoples that he became a priest and a bishop of Guatemala and one of the most powerful advocates for the rights of the Indian peoples. In this particular passage, this has to do with the island of Hispaniola. The Christians, with their horses and swords and lances, began to slaughter and practice strange cruelty among them. They penetrated into the country and spared neither children nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor those in labor, all of whom they ran through the body and lacerated, as though they were assaulting so many lambs herded into their sheepfold. They made bets as to who would split a man in two, or cut off his head at one blow, or they opened up his bowels. They tore the babes from their mother's breast by the feet and dashed their heads against the rocks. Others they seized by the shoulders and threw into the rivers, laughing and joking. And when they fell into the water, they exclaimed, "Boil, body of so-and-so." They spitted the bodies of other babes together with their mothers and all who were before them on their swords. They made a gallows just high enough for the feet to nearly touch the ground, and by 13s, in honor and reverence of our...
After the events witnessed by Las Casas on the island of Hispaniola, similar genocidal acts were carried out on the Lenape people near Fort Amsterdam on Manhattan Island in 1643.
This is a first-person account of a Dutchman who was present on the island of Manhattan when a massacre of Lenape Indians took place. The location is now where the American Indian Museum is in that area of Lower Manhattan. And it took place on February 25th of 1643. The witness was a man named De Vries. The governor, William Kieft, had vowed to force the Lenapes into submission. He had imposed a tax that the Lenape were refusing to pay. De Vries was staying at the governor's place at the fort, and he said, "I remained that night at the governor's sitting up, and I went and sat by the kitchen fire. When around midnight I heard a great shrieking, and I ran to the ramparts of the fort and looked over to Pavonia, saw nothing but firing, and heard the shrieks of the savages murdered in their sleep. When it was day, the soldiers returned to the fort, having massacred or murdered 80 Indians, and considering they had done a deed of Roman valor in murdering so many in their sleep, where infants were torn from their mother's breasts and hacked to pieces in the presence of their parents, and the pieces thrown into the fire and in the water, and other sucklings being bound to small boards were cut, stuck, and pierced, and miserably massacred in a manner to move a heart of stone. Some were thrown into the river, and when the fathers and mothers endeavored to save them, the soldiers would not let them come on land, but made both parents and children drown. Children from 5 to 6 years of age, and also some old and decrepit persons. Those who fled from this onslaught and concealed themselves in the neighboring sedge, and when it was morning came out to beg a piece of bread and to be permitted to warm themselves, were murdered in cold blood and tossed into the fire or the water. Some came to our people in the country with their hands and some with their legs cut off, and some holding their entrails in their arms, and other cuts, and worse than they, could never happen. At a plantation on Curler's Hook on Manhattan, 30 more Indians were similarly massacred that same night. That's the domination that I'm talking about. Those horrendous acts that were committed against so many innocent people that had done nothing wrong.
The largest mass execution in U.S. history occurred in Minnesota on December 26, 1862.
Medicine Bottle, Little Six. 3 years later, on November 11th, 1865. Fort Snelling, Minneapolis, Minnesota.
What happened to the Dakota Nation and the tragic hanging of the 38 plus 2 Dakota men in 1862 and 1865 was a direct outgrowth of the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination.
It was the beginning of the Sioux Land Wars of the 1800s, which culminated in the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee.
My friend Virgil Killstraight from the Oglala Lakota Nation, he has taught me that the 7 laws in English are expressed as honor and respect, compassion and pity, sharing and caring, or to carry the welfare of the people in your heart.
For us, the 7 laws are very simple. The first law is Wachantawanake, which basically means to carry the welfare of the people in your heart. The second law is Wowa Oshila, to have pity and compassion for all living things. So the third law is Waoyu Oniha, which is to have respect and honor those things that we respect, everything that moves, they say.
The massacre at Wounded Knee was the culmination of 19th century manifest destiny.
The fourth law is Wachitchaka. Wachitchaka means to have a grapevine.
425 women, children, and men died at or as a result of the Wounded Knee massacre.
The fifth law is Woachwala. Woachwala means basically to be humble at all times. The sixth law is Woahitike. Woahitike basically means to be guided by your own principles, to discipline yourself. That way you can be brave and be courageous. And the seventh law is Woksape. Woksape basically means wisdom or understanding. That once we learn about the 6 previous laws, we must live according to them.
The United States government awarded 20 Medals of Honor to U.S. soldiers who participated in the Wounded Knee massacre. There are ongoing efforts to have the medals rescinded. They welcomed them.
Well, I think that people in Europe have been through wars, and they understood war. The whole families, the whole nations that were developed, and whole nations were killed. Like during the time of Genghis Khan, his whole tribes is 50 miles wide, and when they start moving, they don't go in one row like that. They move this way. Everything in their paths were 50 miles wide is beaten or used up or killed. That's the way
wars are fought in Europe. The people here are more peaceful, and they're exemplify everything that the 7 laws that I talked about, and to give and to share and to help. Columbus experienced that when he made a remark, one of the people with Columbus made a remark about that gold earring that this woman was wearing, how beautiful it was. She took their earring off and gave it to them. That was generosity, so they were welcome, and they took advantage of it. And there's stories after stories about how, even the Thanksgiving, of how the tribe or the nation that had embraced the pilgrims had helped them through, and they were kept alive because they knew the country, and the ones who came across here didn't. Again, they took advantage of that. They moved west and into Central America. That's the way that they were all welcomed until they started killing people. In the beginning, if that's how it was, they could have stopped them. And if they knew already, at that time who these people were, they could have killed them all as they set foot on their shores. But instead, they were welcome.
Historical demographers have been uncovering in region upon region post-Columbian depopulation rates of between 90 and 98%, with such regularity that an overall decline of 95% has become a working rule of thumb. What this means is that, on average, for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact, when the lands of the Americas teemed with tens of millions of people, only one stood in their place when the bloodbath was over.
David E. Stannard, American Holocaust, 1992.
Indians of the Americas was published by John Collier in 1947. Collier was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1933 to 1945. Chapter 1 is the American Indian and the Long Hope, and it opens like this. They had what the world has lost, they have it now. What the world has lost, the world must have again, lest it die. Not many years are left to have or have not, to recapture the lost ingredient. This is not merely a passing reference to World War III or the atom bomb, although the reference includes these ways of death too. These deaths will mean the end if they come, racial death, self-inflicted, because we have lost the way and the power to live is dead. What in our human world is this power to live? It is the ancient lost reverence and passion for human personality, joined with the ancient lost reverence and passion for the earth and its web of life. This indivisible reverence and passion is what the American Indians almost universally had, and representative groups of them have it still. They had and have this power for living, which our modern world has lost, as worldview and self-view, as tradition and institution. By virtue of this power, the densely populated Inca state, by universal agreement among its people, made the conservation and increase of the earth's resources its fundamental national policy. Never before, never since, has a nation done what the Inca state did. If our modern world should be able to capture this power, the Earth's natural resources and web of life would not be irrevocably wasted within the 20th century, which is the prospect now. True democracy, founded in neighborhoods and reaching over the world, would become the realized heaven on earth, and living peace, not just an interlude between wars, would be born and would last through ages.
Tecumseh.
This is a quote from Tecumseh, our great leader of the Shawnee people, the Shawnee Nation. and it resonates with me because it's very profound in its wisdom. Love your life, perfect your life, beautify all things in your life, seek to make your life long and its purpose the service of your people. Prepare a noble death song for the day when you go over the great divide. Always give a word of salute when meeting or passing a friend, or even a stranger when in a lonely place. Show respect to all people and grovel to none. When you arise in the morning, give thanks for the food and for the joy of living. If you see no reason for giving thanks, the fault lies only with yourself. Abuse no one and nothing, for abuse turns the wise ones into fools and wrongs the spirit of its vision. And I think that's more of the kind of traditional thinking and the traditional teachings that we have as an alternative to the domination subordination system.
In 1992, Stephen Newcomb and Virgil Killstreet founded the Indigenous Law Institute and began a global campaign which called upon Pope John Paul II to formally revoke the Papal Edict of May 4th, 1493. That campaign continues, and it continues to gain new supporters throughout the world. In memoriam, a quote by the late Dakota Nakota visionary scholar and theologian, Vine Deloria Jr.
The doctrine of discovery has never been disclaimed, either by the governments of the Christian nations of the world or by the leaders of the Christian churches of the world. And this is my final question to you. At what point can we as peoples of creation look to Christianity to demand from the political structure of the world our dignity as human beings? At what point can we become men and not mere appendages of the Christian doctrine of discovery? We invite you to support us in ending the domination system. Revoke the papal bulls. All our relations